Dmitry Boundsnitsa on the edge of civilization, together with 9 Japanese female military personnel. Over the years, 73 children were born to the Japanese women from the Soviet soldier, and they never once tried to escape from him. The story is, of course, improbable, but the tale of Dmitry Boundsnitsa, I don't know how reliable this information is, but I'll still share this incredible story. On September 3, 1945, Japan surrendered, bringing World War II to an end. Soviet soldiers, who had defended their homeland from invasion on two fronts, could finally breathe a sigh of relief. However, not all of them returned home. Some died in battle, others succumbed to their wounds later, and some became stranded in foreign lands. There were 600,000 Japanese military personnel in Soviet captivity. Among them were women, nurses, radio operators, and those who worked in the intimate service of officers at comfort stations. To rebuild the USSR after the war, labor was needed, and the prisoners were to be sent to Siberia, where they would plant gardens, cultivate fields, engage in agriculture, and restore ruined cities. However, the Soviet forces lacked sufficient transportation, so prisoners were transferred in small groups. The process dragged on until the end of December 1945. Dmitry Boundsnitsa, but the group was caught in a fierce blizzard shortly after setting out. The road was covered in snow. The driver of the first truck missed the designated marker and got lost in the taiga. The driver of the second truck followed, trusting the first. The first truck drove onto a minefield, its front wheels hitting a mine, damaging the vehicle. The driver and his companion were killed. The second truck was also damaged, making further travel impossible. Inside were 9 captive women who sustained only minor injuries. 2 other soldiers were also in the truck, and at the wheel was Boundsnitsa. He did not want to be punished for a foolish mistake that could cost him his life. He had no choice but to act. Waiting was not an option, and shelter was desperately needed. The blizzard continued, and the captives could barely communicate. Boundsnitsa and the 9 prisoners wandered through the forests for several days. Eventually, they ventured deep into the mountains and decided to set up a temporary camp. Boundsnitsa was familiar with life in remote Siberian settlements. If they survived, he planned to stay. The food from the truck was enough for a while. Over time, the settlers organized their way of life. Traditional Japanese upbringing naturally made Dmitry the leader, simply because he was a man. Boundsnitsa and the women grew vegetables in the summer and foraged for roots. After a year, children started to appear in the group. The women were frightened by the situation, so they tried to satisfy all of Boundsnitsa's needs. They learned a few phrases in Russian, and that became their way of communicating. According to Chinese publications, this way of life in the mountains lasted for only 3 years. But then the Japanese women decided they would no longer tolerate male whims. They forced the soldier to work, and for disobedience, they would punish Dmitry with slaps. Whether this is true or not is hard to say, but the women still became pregnant year after year and gave birth. In such conditions, feeding the children became a challenge. The growing number of mouths to feed required more food. As the soldier later recounted, he and the women who were not close to giving birth would go into the forest every day, gathering mushrooms and berries and hunting animals. They prepared and dried the food, so there would be something to eat in the winter. Surprisingly, during their 19 years in the mountains, these people never encountered another human being. Even more astonishing is that the exact location of their settlement remains unknown. Years passed, the children grew up, and the Japanese women became increasingly uncontrollable. Now, it was no longer Dmitry giving orders but the women. It got to the point where he had to satisfy them multiple times a night. Unable to endure this any longer, Balsnitsa finally escaped. He made his way to a local precinct and told the officers what had happened to him. Allegedly, he tearfully begged to be sent to a Russian prison just to get away from the cruel Japanese women. Based on the description Balsnitsa provided, law enforcement officers found a small settlement deep in the mountains where 9 Japanese women lived with their children, 73 children in total. The oldest was 18. Of course, it's hard to believe. How did the women give birth? Was there really not a single death during all that time? How did they never follow? And most importantly, how did they never once come across another human being? And why did no one search for them? Regardless, in 1964, Dmitry Balsnitsa and his harem were finally discovered. By then, the Soviet Union's policy toward Japanese prisoners of war had changed, and the authorities decided to repatriate the women and their children to Japan. The Japanese government accepted them all and granted citizenship to the children. What Dmitry had feared all along came true. Balsnitsa was charged with rape and illegal captivity of the women in the mountains. For all this, the Soviet soldier was sentenced to 12 years in a labor camp. He served half his sentence but still considered himself lucky. He said that life in a Soviet prison was 100 times better than life in the mountains. 9 Japanese women and their children. That's the story. Whether to believe it or not is up to you.